My older sister made my teenage years a living nightmare, while my parents shielded her from every consequence. When I refused to take the fall for her crime at 18, they threw me out into the freezing rain with a single $200 bill and one bag. 15 years later, my mother cornered me at a high society gala, demanding I go to federal prison to save her precious golden child. Then I heard why she was begging, and I started laughing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after your family tried to destroy you. My name is Caroline, 33 years old, and I am a senior crisis public relations consultant in Chicago. I handle scandals for politicians and corporate executives. Last night, I attended the annual winter charity auction at the Waldorf Astoria. The ballroom was packed with the wealthiest elites in the city. I was sitting at a VIP table near the front stage, quietly reviewing an email from my husband Ethan, when an ice-cold liquid suddenly soaked through the back of my silk dress. The shock made me gasp. I stood up quickly as a crystal champagne flute shattered against the polished marble floor next to my chair. My mother Catherine stood right behind me. Her face was flushed with a terrifying mix of rage and panic. She slammed a thick legal folder onto my table, knocking over my untouched plate of food. "Sign this confession right now," she hissed. Her voice vibrated with a frantic desperation I had never heard before. Other guests at nearby tables stopped their conversations and turned their heads to watch the spectacle. I calmly picked up a cloth napkin and began dabbing at the expensive champagne dripping down my neck. "What are you talking about, Mother?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level to contrast with her hysteria. She leaned in close so only I could hear the venom in her words. "You are going to sign this paper, admitting you embezzled $2 million from your sister's charity foundation. You owe her this, Caroline. You ruined her life when you were 18 by refusing to take the blame for that little hit-and-run accident. You owe this family for everything we did for you. We gave you startup capital when you left the house, and now it is time to pay us back." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by her delusion. The startup capital she was referring to was a single crumpled $200 bill my father had thrown at my face before locking the front door. They had left me to freeze on the porch because I would not go to jail for a car crash my drunk sister caused. I had spent 15 years building a multi-million-dollar agency from that single bill, and now she dared to use it as leverage. Before I could tell my mother exactly where she could shove her legal folder, Savannah appeared from the crowd. My 36-year-old sister looked like a tragic heroine from a daytime soap opera. She was wearing a custom couture gown that cost more than most people make in an entire year, but her expensive makeup was running down her cheeks from fresh tears. She grabbed my arm with trembling hands, her acrylic nails digging into my skin. "Caroline, please!" Savannah sobbed loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear her performance. "You have to do this for me. Malcolm is going to kill me if he finds out the money is gone. You just do public relations garbage anyway. You clean up media trash for a living. Going to a white-collar federal prison for a few years will not destroy your life, but it will completely destroy my marriage." I looked at my older sister in absolute disgust. Malcolm was her husband. He was an African-American real estate tycoon from Atlanta, the sole heir to a billion-dollar commercial property empire. Malcolm was brilliant, strictly disciplined, and fiercely protective of his family's flawless reputation. Savannah had spent the last 5 years pretending to be the perfect charitable high society wife to match his elevated status. Now the mask was finally slipping. Savannah tightened her grip on my arm, shaking me slightly. "The auditors are coming tomorrow morning, Caroline. If Malcolm finds out I took the charity money, he will divorce me. He will leave me with nothing. Mom and Dad already set it up so your old documents were used to make you the vice president of finance for the fund. Your name is on the internal documents. On paper, you are already guilty. Just sign the confession so the police will take you instead of me. You are my sister. You are supposed to protect me." I looked from Savannah's pathetic weeping face to my mother's demanding glare. They actually believed I was still the frightened 18-year-old girl they could manipulate and discard at will. They thought they had backed me into a corner with their secretly forged documents and public pressure. They expected me to break down to cry or to quietly accept the blame to avoid a public scandal. I gently pried Savannah's fingers off my ruined dress, refusing to break eye contact with her. The music in the ballroom seemed to fade away as the silence around our table grew heavier. The wealthy donors and socialites were watching us, like hawks waiting for my reaction. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I certainly did not reach for a pen to sign their ridiculous confession. I simply reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and sent a single text message to my assistant, who was stationed in the audiovisual booth upstairs. The trap they thought they had set for me was nothing compared to the one I had been building for them. What happened next would ensure my family never tried to use me as a human shield again. I dropped my phone back into my clutch, the screen going dark. My mother mistook my silence for submission. She smiled a nasty, triumphant twisting of her lips and leaned closer across the ruined table. The heavy scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the stale smell of the champagne she had just thrown at me. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the thick legal folder. "You really thought you could just walk away from us, Caroline," my mother whispered harshly. "You thought you could build your little crisis management firm and ignore your own blood. But your father and I are always one step ahead. 5 years ago, when you were foolish enough to leave a box of your old tax returns and identification documents in our basement, your father held on to them. We knew a selfish girl like you would eventually need to be put in her place." Savannah stopped her theatrical sobbing for a moment. The vulnerable weeping sister act vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare that I recognized all too well. She smoothed down the front of her custom gown and crossed her arms. "Do not look at me like that," Savannah snapped, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "I had no choice. Malcolm is auditing the charity accounts tomorrow morning. You know how he is. Malcolm comes from a legacy of Atlanta real estate billionaires. His family built an empire from the ground up, and they demand absolute perfection from everyone around them. If he finds out $2 million is missing from the foundation, his lawyers will annihilate me. They will leave me with absolutely nothing." My mother opened the folder, revealing a stack of corporate filings bearing the official seal of the state of Illinois. "Look at them," Catherine demanded. "Your father used your old documents to officially list you as the vice president of finance for Savannah's Charity Foundation. We filed the paperwork 3 years ago. Your social security number, your signature, your liability. Every single fraudulent transfer, every missing dollar, it all leads directly back to you. On paper, you are the mastermind who drained the charity." I looked down at the documents. The forgery was actually quite impressive. My father William had always been a meticulous man when it came to saving his own skin. He had perfectly replicated my signature from an old college application. They had set this trap years in advance, keeping me as their ultimate insurance policy, just in case Savannah's reckless spending ever caught up with her. "You are going to take the fall for this," Savannah said, leaning over the table until she was inches from my face. "You are going to sign this confession stating you exploited your position as a crisis public relations consultant to manipulate the charity's funds. You will tell the authorities you acted alone. If you do this quietly, Malcolm's family will probably just let you go to federal prison for a few years without making a massive media spectacle. If you fight us, we will hand these forged documents to the FBI tonight, and we will tell the press that you are a vindictive, unstable sister trying to ruin my marriage." My mother nodded in agreement, crossing her arms. "You owe your sister this sacrifice, Caroline. You owed her 15 years ago when you selfishly refused to take the blame for that car accident. We lost so much money keeping Savannah out of jail back then. Now it is your turn to pay your debt to this family. You are just a consultant. Savannah is the wife of a billionaire heir. Her reputation is far more valuable than your freedom." The sheer audacity of their plan was almost breathtaking. They truly believed they could steal $2 million, frame me for a federal crime, and force me to willingly walk into a prison cell just to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. They thought my refusal to scream or cry meant I was paralyzed by fear. I calmly picked up a clean linen napkin from the table. I wiped the last drops of sticky champagne from my collarbone and smoothed the fabric of my dress. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. When you spend your entire career managing catastrophic corporate crises, you learn exactly how to handle amateur blackmailers, even when those blackmailers share your last name. Are you quite finished? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. Savannah scowled, clearly unsettled by my calm demeanor. Do not try to play tough, Caroline. You have no way out of this. The documents are filed. The money is gone. Malcolm will be here any minute, and he brings his security detail everywhere. If you do not sign that confession before he walks into this ballroom, I will start screaming that you attacked me. I will tell him you stole his money. I tossed the damp napkin onto the table right on top of their forged documents. You both have made a severe miscalculation, I said, looking directly into my mother's eyes. You assume Malcolm's family built a billion-dollar empire by being easily fooled. You assume a man like Malcolm does not notice when $2 million vanishes from his wife's vanity charity. And your biggest mistake of all is assuming I am still the helpless 18-year-old girl you threw out onto the street. My mother's face flushed with anger. She reached for her phone. I am calling the police right now, she threatened, her voice rising slightly. I am going to tell them my daughter is a thief. We will see how brave you act when you are in handcuffs. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that finally made my sister take a hesitant step backward. You do not need to call anyone, Mother, I replied softly. I already took care of the entertainment for tonight. I glanced toward the massive audiovisual booth suspended above the back of the ballroom. I had sent the text message to my assistant exactly 2 minutes ago. The countdown was over. The trap they had spent 3 years building for me was about to be obliterated by the reality of my own design. I adjusted my posture, kept my eyes locked on Savannah, and waited for the screens to light up. A sharp burst of static echoed through the grand ballroom, cutting off the soft classical music that had been playing all evening. Every head in the room turned toward the main stage. The massive projector screen, which had been displaying a looping logo of Savannah's youth education charity, flickered violently. Instead of the scheduled, heartwarming promotional video showing underprivileged children, the screen snapped to a crisp, high-definition spreadsheet. It was a forensic audit of the foundation's operating account. The silence in the room was absolute, followed by a collective gasp from hundreds of wealthy donors. My assistant had perfectly timed the visual presentation. The screen automatically zoomed in on a series of wire transfers. $300,000 routed to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. $500,000 wired directly to a VIP casino suite in Monaco. $75,000 spent at a Hermès boutique in Paris in a single afternoon. Right next to every exorbitant purchase was Savannah's name, her private offshore account number, and the exact timestamp of the transaction. The final slide transitioned to show a private jet charter to Milan, paid for entirely by the Youth Education Scholarship Fund. Savannah spun around to look at the stage. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost draped in couture. She let out a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "Turn it off! Somebody cut the power right now!" She frantically waved her arms at the stage crew, her voice cracking as the sophisticated socialite persona completely dissolved into pure, unfiltered panic. My mother stood frozen, her jaw unhinged as she stared at the glowing, undeniable proof of her golden child's crimes. She tried to step in front of me as if her physical body could somehow block the massive screen suspended 20 feet in the air. "Caroline, what did you do?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Turn that off immediately. You are destroying your sister." "I did not do anything except forward a few interesting documents to the audiovisual team," I said smoothly. "You both thought my career was just about cleaning up media trash. You forgot that to clean up a corporate crisis, my agency employs the best forensic accountants and cyber investigators in the country. It took my team less than 48 hours to trace the missing $2 million. Savannah did not even try to hide the money well. She just moved it through a dummy corporation that used her own middle name." The murmurs in the ballroom were growing into an uproar. These were politicians, real estate developers, and legacy philanthropists. They were looking at their own generous donations being used to fund my sister's European gambling trips and luxury shopping sprees. People were already pulling out their phones, snapping photos of the projector screen before anyone could pull the plug. The scandal was out. There was no containing it now. Savannah hiked up her heavy gown and actually tried to run toward the audiovisual booth, screaming for the hotel staff to call security on my assistant. She looked entirely deranged, her heels slipping on the marble floor where the champagne had spilled earlier. My mother grabbed my shoulders, digging her nails in. "You malicious, ungrateful girl," she spat. "We will ruin you for this. Your father will take every cent you own." I easily shoved her hands away and grabbed my clutch from the table. "My father cannot touch me, and neither can you. You wanted me to take the fall to protect Savannah's marriage, but you should have known I do not play the scapegoat anymore. Have a wonderful evening, Mother. Try the crab cakes, they are fantastic." I turned my back on her, intending to walk out of the ballroom and leave them to face the wrath of the defrauded donors. I needed to get back to my office and prepare my team for the inevitable media storm that would hit by morning. But as I moved toward the grand double doors at the back of the hall, the crowd suddenly parted. The chaotic shouting and angry murmurs died down, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. I stopped in my tracks. Standing directly in front of the exit doors was Malcolm. At 6'3" with an imposing athletic build and wearing a flawless bespoke tuxedo, my brother-in-law commanded absolute authority. As the heir to an Atlanta commercial real estate empire, Malcolm possessed a natural, quiet intimidation that made powerful men nervous. Tonight his dark eyes were blazing with a cold, controlled fury that sent a chill down my spine. I was not alone. 4 massive security guards in black suits flanked him, effectively sealing the exits. No one was leaving this room. Savannah saw her husband standing there and let out a pathetic, wailing sob. She rushed toward him, her arms outstretched, ready to play the victim and spin her web of lies. She was likely preparing to tell him that I had hacked the screens and falsified the documents out of pure jealousy. But Malcolm did not even look at his weeping wife. He did not look at my mother, who was rushing over to run damage control. He simply raised a hand, signaling his security guards to step forward and form a physical barrier between him and Savannah. His intense, unwavering gaze bypassed the chaos of his ruined wife and locked entirely on me. Malcolm stood like a monolith of absolute power. Savannah reached for his arm, her diamond rings catching the harsh light of the frozen projector screen above us. She opened her mouth to spout another lie, ready to swear I had fabricated the offshore bank records. Malcolm simply raised one hand. He did not look at her. He did not even flinch at the sound of her crying. He gestured to one of his security guards, who quickly stepped onto the stage, unhooked a microphone from the podium, and handed it down to him. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Hundreds of Chicago elites held their breath. They expected Malcolm to defend his wife's honor. They expected him to turn his wrath on the woman who had just exposed a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. He turned his dark, unreadable eyes entirely on me. "Caroline," he said, his deep voice amplified through the ballroom speakers. "You have just committed a severe act of corporate espionage. You hacked a secure financial institution, illegally obtained private banking records, and publicly defamed my wife in a room full of our most vital philanthropic partners." I stared back at him. My heart beat in a steady, calculated rhythm. Savannah let out a breathless gasp of relief behind him. My mother, Catherine, suddenly stood a little taller, her triumphant smirk returning. They actually thought Malcolm was buying their narrative. They thought the billionaire heir was stepping up to act as their ultimate attack dog. "I will not tolerate an attack on my family name." Malcolm continued, his tone cold and exact. "Your little stunt tonight was a direct strike against my estate. And in the business world, actions like this require immediate restitution. Since you are so adept at managing public relations and corporate structures, I am making you a very simple offer." He snapped his fingers. Another man in a sharp gray suit stepped forward from the shadows of the security detail. He was clearly a corporate lawyer. He held a thick leather portfolio. "You own a highly profitable crisis management firm here in Chicago," Malcolm said, projecting his voice so the entire room could witness my execution. "I want it. You will transfer 100% of your controlling shares, your client lists, and your firm's assets to my family's holding company in Atlanta. You will sign the transfer agreement as compensation for the damages you caused my wife tonight. If you agree, I will graciously overlook this cybercrime. If you refuse, I will use every resource at my disposal to absolutely annihilate you." The audacity of his demand sent a ripple of shocked whispers through the wealthy crowd. He was not just defending Savannah, he was publicly attempting to swallow my entire life's work in one bite. My mother let out a sharp, cruel laugh. You heard him, Caroline, she sneered, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Malcolm's lawyer. You played a stupid game and now you have lost everything. Sign your company over. It is the only way you will stay out of federal prison. You should have taken the deal when I offered it to you. We threw you out onto the street 15 years ago and you survived. You can survive starting over again. Give the man your company. I looked at the people who shared my blood. They were giddy with excitement. They were watching my hard-earned empire being threatened by a man with unlimited power, and they loved it. They thought they had finally won. I looked back at Malcolm. He stood perfectly still waiting for my submission. I give you until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Malcolm said, his voice dropping to a menacingly quiet register that required no microphone. If the signed transfer agreement is not on my desk by exactly 8 in the morning, I will make a few phone calls. I will freeze your business accounts. I will have my associates pull every single contract they have with your firm. You will be bankrupt before your morning coffee gets cold. Do we understand each other, Caroline? I slowly looked at the giant projector screen still displaying Savannah's shopping spree in Paris. Then I looked at the armed security guards blocking the exit. Finally, I met Malcolm's eyes. I understand exactly what kind of man you are, Malcolm, I said. My voice was completely steady, cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. I understand that you think money buys obedience. But my company is not for sale, and it certainly is not available to pay off my sister's gambling debts. I stepped forward, walking directly toward the wall of security guards. My mother gasped, clearly expecting the men in black suits to tackle me to the marble floor. I stopped just inches from Malcolm. We were close enough that I could see the subtle tightening of his jaw. You have until 8 in the morning, he repeated softly. I smiled. It was a freezing, unapologetic smile. Have a wonderful evening, Malcolm. Try to keep a better eye on your wallet. I did not wait for his response. I turned and walked straight through the gap in the security detail. They parted just enough to let me pass, their eyes darting to Malcolm for orders, but he gave none. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom and walked out into the cool night air of Chicago. I did not sleep that night. I went straight to my downtown office. My husband Ethan was already there waiting for me. As a former federal prosecutor, Ethan understood the legal mechanics of financial warfare better than anyone. We spent the entire night preparing for the inevitable strike. I briefed my core team, secured our sensitive data, and braced for the impact of a billionaire's wrath. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a bright, unforgiving light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. Ethan stood by my desk holding 2 cups of black coffee. He checked his watch. It is 7:59, Ethan said quietly. We watched the digital clock on my computer monitor. The seconds ticked by in agonizing slow motion. Malcolm had promised destruction. My parents were likely sitting in their luxury hotel suite right now, toasting to my downfall, eagerly waiting for the moment my life would crumble. The clock struck 8. Nothing happened immediately. Then, at exactly 8:01, my desk phone rang. It was my lead accountant. Her voice was shaking. Caroline, she said, sounding completely panicked. I just tried to process the payroll batch for this week. Every single corporate credit card we have was just declined. The bank says there is a massive hold on our operating accounts pending a third-party legal review. I hung up the phone. Ethan looked at me, his jaw set in a hard line. Malcolm was not bluffing. He had pulled the trigger. My accounts were frozen, my business was paralyzed, and the corporate siege had officially begun. The receiver of my desk phone felt incredibly heavy as I placed it back on the cradle. Ethan did not need me to repeat what my lead accountant had just told me. As a former federal prosecutor, my husband could read the cold, hard reality setting into my features. Malcolm had actually done it. He had weaponized his family's massive financial infrastructure to paralyze my public relations agency in a matter of seconds. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city traffic was just beginning to build, the streets filling with people completely unaware of the corporate bloodbath taking place inside my walls. Ethan immediately opened his laptop and began typing with furious precision. He bypassed our frozen internal network and accessed the public commercial court dockets. Malcolm did not just freeze the accounts, Ethan said, his eyes scanning lines of dense legal text. He filed an emergency ex parte injunction at dawn. His lawyers used Savannah's charity foundation as the plaintiff. They are claiming you transferred the missing $2 million directly into your agency's operating fund, effectively making your entire business a crime scene. It is a completely fabricated claim, but it is enough for a judge to lock your accounts pending a federal investigation. My desk phone rang again. Then my cell phone lit up. Outside my glass office doors, I could see the agency bullpen erupting into chaos. Dozens of my employees were staring at their computer screens in confusion. Red error messages flashed across their monitors as they found themselves locked out of vendor payment portals. I took a deep, steadying breath forcefully, compartmentalizing the betrayal of my own family. I am a crisis manager. Panic is a luxury I absolutely cannot afford. I walked out of my private executive suite and stood at the top of the short staircase overlooking the main work floor. The low roar of anxious voices died down immediately as my staff looked up at me. Listen to me carefully. I projected my voice to reach every corner of the room. We are currently experiencing a targeted financial attack from a hostile third party. Our operating accounts are temporarily locked. Do not panic. No one is losing their job, and your payroll is secured through a completely separate trust. I want all non-essential outbound communications halted immediately. Draft a holding statement citing an internal software migration for any vendor payment delays. Put your heads down and get to work. They nodded in unison, the absolute authority in my voice anchoring them. I returned to my office and firmly shut the glass doors. Ethan was already on his cell phone pacing the length of the room with a dangerous energy. The bleeding had only just begun. My personal cell phone vibrated with a text message from a major client. He was a prominent state senator who heavily relied on campaign funding from commercial real estate developers. The message was brief and cowardly. "Caroline, I am sorry. I have to pull my retainer." Malcolm made a call. Within 20 minutes, 3 of my largest corporate clients officially terminated their contracts. The second cancellation came via a terse email from the CEO of a major logistics firm. His company utilized massive distribution warehouses entirely owned by Malcolm's family trust in Georgia. The third cancellation was a brutal phone call from a national retail chain heavily invested in Malcolm's commercial plazas. It was a perfectly orchestrated corporate massacre. Malcolm was flexing his billionaire leverage, systematically starving my agency of revenue. He wanted me to watch my life's work turn to dust before lunchtime. Ethan ended his call and rubbed the back of his neck. "I just spoke with a judge I know from my prosecution days. Malcolm's legal team is ruthless. They have essentially thrown a heavy blanket over your entire financial existence. We can fight the injunction, but lifting it will take at least 48 hours. Malcolm knows this. He is trying to force you to surrender the company before we can even get a hearing." "He is trying to suffocate me," I replied, staring at the growing list of canceled contracts on my monitor. My parents threw me out into the cold 15 years ago, and now they are trying to freeze me out of my own industry to protect Savannah. "I refuse to let them win," Ethan said, coming around the desk to stand closely beside me. "We have emergency funds in my private accounts. We can keep the lights on and pay your core team out of pocket for a month if we have to. They discarded you when you were 18. They handed you a single $200 bill and told you that you were worthless. Now they are trying to steal the worth you created. We just need to stop the media from catching wind of what happened at the charity gala last night. If the press finds out your sister accused you of embezzling $2 million, your remaining clients will vanish by noon." I knew he was entirely right. In the fast-paced world of public relations, public perception is everything. If the market believed I was a criminal, my agency would be completely worthless by sunset. We needed to launch a counter-narrative, something massive to distract the financial press, while Ethan worked the legal channels to unfreeze my accounts. I sat down at my keyboard and began typing a press release, preparing to leak a strategic anonymous tip about Savannah's offshore gambling habits to a friendly journalist. I needed to shift the spotlight directly back onto my golden child sister before she could finish framing me. Just as I hit save on the document, a sharp metallic ding echoed through my office suite. Ethan and I both froze. The sound came from the private executive elevator. The only people who had access to that specific elevator code were myself, Ethan, and my building manager. The heavy steel doors slowly slid open with a quiet hum. Stepping onto the plush carpet of my private reception area was my father, William. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a smirk so arrogant it made my stomach physically turn. He was not alone. Walking right behind him was a slick, expensive-looking corporate lawyer I did not recognize. My father strolled into my office as if he already owned the entire building. He did not look like a man whose daughter had just exposed a massive financial fraud. He looked exactly like a conqueror arriving to claim his ultimate prize. Tucked firmly under his right arm, he carried a thick, heavy legal binder. "Good morning, Caroline," my father said, his voice dripping with a sickeningly false warmth. "You have an absolutely beautiful view up here. It is a real shame you will not be keeping it." I remained standing behind my desk, my posture perfectly rigid. I looked at the man who had shared half his DNA with me. He looked entirely too pleased with himself. The lawyer with him was a man in his late 50s wearing a suit that was expensive but poorly tailored. He had the unmistakable aura of a corporate predator, the kind of man who specialized in bullying small business owners into submission. My father slammed the thick, heavy legal binder directly onto my glass desk. The loud thud echoed in the quiet executive suite. He tapped the leather cover with his index finger, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "What is this, William?" I asked, deliberately using his first name. I had stopped calling him Dad a decade ago. "This is a funding agreement," my father replied smoothly. He walked over to my personal wet bar, picked up a crystal tumbler, and actually poured himself a glass of sparkling water. "It is a legally binding acknowledgement of the seed capital I provided to launch this little public relations agency of yours." I stared at him, genuinely wondering if he was suffering from a severe psychological break. "You never gave me a single dime to start this company," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "I built this agency from the ground up. I worked 3 jobs, I skipped meals, and I took out commercial business loans that I paid off myself. You have absolutely zero financial connection to my business." My father took a sip of his water and smiled. "That is where you are wrong, Caroline. 15 years ago, when you decided to be stubborn and leave our house, I handed you $200. That was your initial startup capital. You used my money to secure your first nights in a motel, which allowed you to survive, get a job, and eventually open this business. Legally, that makes me your first angel investor." The sheer breathtaking audacity of his delusion made the air leave my lungs. He was talking about the night he and my mother threw me out into a freezing rainstorm. I was 18 years old. I had just refused to confess to a hit-and-run accident that Savannah had caused while driving drunk. To protect their golden child from prison, my parents had packed my clothes into a plastic trash bag, shoved a crumpled $200 bill into my hand, and locked the deadbolt. I had spent that night sleeping on a plastic chair in a bus terminal because the $200 was not even enough for a safe hotel room in that part of the city. Now, 15 years later, he was standing in my multi-million-dollar office, looking out at the Chicago skyline and claiming that traumatic eviction was a corporate investment. The sleazy lawyer stepped forward, opening the binder to reveal a stack of freshly printed documents. "My client is asserting a 50% equity stake in your agency under the doctrine of foundational investment," the lawyer said, his voice slick and condescending. "Given that you were an 18-year-old dependent who utilized his capital to establish your financial independence. We have filed retroactive paperwork claiming joint ownership of this public relations firm." "That is not how the law works," I said, leaning forward and resting my hands on the desk. "Any judge in the state of Illinois would laugh you out of the courtroom for trying to claim a $200 eviction payout, translates to 50% equity of an enterprise worth tens of millions of dollars." "Maybe so," the lawyer said with a greasy, unapologetic smile. "But corporate litigation takes years, and right now, your operating accounts are frozen by a third-party injunction. You do not have the liquid capital to fight a protracted ownership dispute in civil court, which means my client's claim holds immediate leverage." My father set his water glass down on my desk, leaving a condensation ring on the pristine glass. "You see, Caroline, we already solved the family crisis. You were being difficult last night at the gala, so I took matters into my own hands. I proved to Malcolm that I am a man who handles his business." "What did you do?" I asked, my eyes narrowing at his smug expression. I went to see Malcolm at his Hotel Pentus this morning, William announced proudly. I showed him this funding agreement. I proved to him that I own half of your company. And since Savannah's charity foundation is currently missing $2 million, I did the honorable thing as a father. I signed my 50% equity of your agency over to Malcolm's real estate holding company to completely pay off your sister's debt. My father leaned over my desk, his face inches from mine, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. Malcolm accepted the trade. Savannah is completely off the hook. Her marriage to a billionaire is safe, and her reputation is spotless. And you, Caroline, no longer own a controlling interest in this firm. Malcolm's corporate transition team will be here by noon to begin the hostile takeover. I looked down at the forged, nonsensical legal documents sitting on my desk. My parents had literally sold a company they did not own, using a fake investment claim to pay off money my sister had stolen to buy designer handbags in Monaco. They thought this twisted illegal maneuver was brilliant. You are going to pack your personal items into a single cardboard box. My father ordered, his voice dropping into the same harsh, authoritative tone he used the night he kicked me out of my childhood home. I am evicting you again, Caroline. But this time you do not even get to keep the $200. He stood back, crossing his arms, waiting for me to shatter. He expected the panic to finally set in. He expected me to fall to my knees and beg him to stop, to plead for my life's work. I did not break. I simply shifted my gaze past his shoulder. Throughout this entire agonizing exchange, my husband Ethan had remained perfectly still in the shadows near the corner of my office. My father and his sleazy lawyer had been so blinded by their own arrogance that they had completely ignored his presence. Ethan stepped into the morning light. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, and his expression was completely devoid of mercy. He did not say a word to my father. He simply walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the heavy glass doors of my executive suite. He grabbed the stainless steel handles, pulled the doors firmly shut, and turned the heavy deadbolt. A loud, definitive click echoed through the silent room. My father frowned, turning to look at Ethan. "What are you doing? Open that door. We are finished here." Ethan ignored him entirely. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out his cell phone, and pressed a single button on his speed dial. He lifted the phone to his ear, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto the sleazy corporate lawyer, whose greasy smile was suddenly beginning to fade. Ethan lowered his cell phone and slipped it into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He did not say a single word to my father or the sleazy corporate attorney. Instead, my husband simply smiled. It was the cold, predatory smile of a man who had spent his entire career putting arrogant white-collar criminals behind bars. Ethan turned around, grabbed the heavy stainless steel handles of my office doors, and unlocked the deadbolt. He pulled the glass doors wide open. Standing perfectly still in the center of my reception area were two men in dark, conservative suits. They did not look like private security guards, and they certainly did not look like corporate executives. They carried themselves with a rigid, undeniable authority that immediately shifted the air pressure in the room. The chatter from my public relations staff in the bullpen completely died down as the two men stepped past the reception desk and walked directly into my private executive suite. William frowned, his chest puffing out as he tried to maintain his illusion of control. He pointed an accusatory finger at my husband. "What kind of intimidation tactic is this, Ethan?" my father demanded. "Are these your private bodyguards? Because let me remind you, I am now a 50% owner of this company. I can have you thrown off the premises for trespassing." Ethan chuckled softly. He stepped aside, allowing the two men to fully enter the office. "William," Ethan said, his voice smooth and deadly quiet, "I would like to introduce you to Special Agent Bennett and Special Agent Foster. They are from the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they are not here for me." The color instantly drained from my father's face. The smug, victorious smirk that had been plastered across his features just moments ago vanished, replaced by a sudden, creeping terror. The greasy corporate lawyer standing next to my father stiffened. His eyes darted from the heavy legal binder on my desk to the two federal agents. As an attorney, he recognized the gravity of the situation far quicker than my father did. Ethan stepped forward, moving with the practiced precision of a seasoned federal prosecutor delivering an opening statement. Let me break down exactly what you two geniuses just did this morning. Ethan began looking directly at the sweating lawyer. You fabricated a funding agreement based on a $200 cash eviction from 15 years ago. You then used that fraudulent foundation to forge my wife's signature, claiming to transfer 50% of a multi-million-dollar corporate entity to a third-party holding company. The lawyer swallowed hard, taking a slow, involuntary step away from my father. Now in a local civil court, that might just be a standard case of fraud. Ethan continued, his voice echoing in the silent office. But you made a critical error. You took those forged documents, and you actively negotiated a transfer of assets to Malcolm's holding company, which is headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. By transmitting fraudulent financial documents across state lines to settle a $2 million embezzlement debt for Savannah, you triggered federal jurisdiction. Agent Bennett pulled back his suit jacket, resting his hand near his belt. You have committed federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and interstate commerce violations, the agent stated firmly. Each of those counts carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison. The sleazy corporate lawyer completely panicked, his professional arrogance shattered into a million pieces. He realized his entire career, his law license and his freedom were evaporating right in front of his eyes. He threw his hands up in the air, physically backing away until he bumped into my office wall. I was misled, the lawyer stammered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. My client assured me that the foundational investment narrative was legally sound. He told me he had proof of the startup capital. I had no idea the documents were entirely fabricated. I am cooperating fully with the federal authorities. I did not forge anything. You spineless coward, my father shouted, turning on his own legal counsel. You told me this strategy was bulletproof. You said Malcolm would accept the transfer, and the courts would be too tied up to stop it. The lawyer did not even look at my father. He bolted for the door, desperate to escape the executive suite and distance himself from the crime scene. Agent Foster casually stepped directly into his path, blocking the exit with his imposing frame. The lawyer shrank back, sweating profusely, realizing there was absolutely no way out of the trap they had walked into. My father was breathing heavily. His hands began to shake. The reality of a federal indictment was crashing down on his shoulders, crushing his delusions of grandeur. He looked over at me, his eyes wide and pleading. He was expecting the obedient, frightened daughter he had bullied for 18 years to magically reappear and save him. Caroline, my father pleaded, his voice dropping an octave as he desperately tried to play the family card. Caroline, you need to tell them to stop. Tell your husband to call off his friends. This is a family matter. We can negotiate this privately. I am your father. You cannot let them send me to federal prison. I looked at the man who had prioritized Savannah's happiness over my basic survival for my entire life. I looked at the man who had come into my office this morning fully intending to steal my life's work and throw me out onto the street for a second time. I do not negotiate with criminals, I replied, my voice as cold as ice. And a real father does not throw his teenage daughter into a freezing rainstorm to protect a drunk driver. You made your choice 15 years ago, William. Today is simply the consequence. Agent Bennett stepped forward. He reached around to the back of his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clinking sound was deafening in the tense silence of the room. William physically shrank back, pressing himself against my wet bar as the federal agent approached him. Sir, place your hands behind your back, Agent Bennett ordered. My father raised his trembling hands, preparing to surrender to the authorities. His reign of manipulation was finally over. But just as the cold metal cuffs were about to snap around his wrists, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the silence in the room. It was my father's cell phone. William flinched. He looked down at his jacket pocket, then looked up at the federal agent, silently asking for permission to answer. Agent Bennett nodded once, motioning for him to take the phone out slowly. With shaking, clumsy fingers, my father pulled the phone from his pocket. He saw the caller identification and swiped the screen to answer. Because his hands were trembling so violently, he accidentally tapped the speakerphone button instead of bringing the device to his ear. Savannah's voice instantly blared through my quiet office, but she was no longer playing the composed, sophisticated billionaire's wife. She was screaming in absolute hysterical terror. Dad, help me! Savannah shrieked through the phone speaker, her voice accompanied by the loud wailing siren of a rushing ambulance. "Dad, something is wrong. I am bleeding. They are taking me to the emergency room right now. You have to get Malcolm. He is going to kill me." The federal agents paused, exchanging a sharp glance. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he listened to my sister's frantic, terrified sobbing echo across my executive suite. Savannah continued to sob hysterically through the speaker of my father's phone. Her voice was sharp and piercing, echoing off the glass walls of my executive suite. She cried out that the doctors were rushing her on a stretcher, that the severe stress of the morning had caused terrible cramping, and that she was terrified of losing the baby. My father grabbed the phone with both hands, his knuckles turning white. He looked up at Special Agent Bennett, all of his previous arrogance completely replaced by a frantic, wild desperation. "You cannot arrest me," William pleaded, his voice cracking. "You hear her. My daughter is pregnant. She is in the emergency room right now. If you put me in handcuffs and it hits the news, the shock will kill my unborn grandchild. You have to let me go to the hospital." Agent Bennett and Agent Foster exchanged a hard, tactical glance. As federal investigators, they were accustomed to criminals inventing sudden medical emergencies to avoid detention. But before either agent could instruct my father to put the phone down, the heavy glass doors of my office swung open once again. Stepping into the room was a team of 3 men wearing immaculate razor-sharp suits. They moved with the synchronized aggressive precision of an elite corporate strike force. I recognized the man leading the pack. He was the head of litigation for Malcolm's family empire, a ruthless legal shark who operated entirely out of Atlanta. He must have been waiting down in the lobby of my building to finalize the hostile takeover of my public relations firm. Hearing about Savannah's medical emergency, he had immediately mobilized. The lead attorney stepped directly between my father and the federal agents. He did not introduce himself politely. He simply raised a hand, physically halting Agent Bennett's approach. "I am Senior Executive Counsel for the Family Trust," the lawyer stated, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Gentlemen, you are currently attempting to detain the father-in-law of my client without a formal grand jury indictment. You are doing so based on an alleged forged document during an active corporate dispute. And you are doing this while his daughter, the wife of a prominent billionaire and the mother of his unborn heir, is suffering a severe high-risk medical emergency." The lawyer stepped closer to the agents, lowering his voice into a dangerous, threatening register. "If you place this man in handcuffs today and the resulting media spectacle causes my client's wife to suffer a miscarriage, I will personally ensure that the ensuing civil liability lawsuit bankrupts the federal government. I will tie up your field office in endless litigation. You will be held personally responsible for the loss of a third-generation heir to a billion-dollar estate. Do we understand each other?" The air in my office grew incredibly dense. The threat was not just a bluff. Malcolm's family had the financial leverage and the political connections to destroy the careers of everyone in the room. They could bury the FBI field office in so much red tape and public backlash that the wire fraud case would be permanently stalled. I looked at Ethan. My husband's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. As a former federal prosecutor, Ethan knew exactly how the game was played at this level of wealth. A federal indictment required absolute airtight precision. If the agents arrested William right now, Malcolm's high-powered legal team would immediately file a barrage of injunctions claiming federal harassment resulting in medical trauma. They would turn William into a victim. Ethan gave Agent Bennett a barely perceptible nod. It was a silent communication between men who understood the law. They needed to secure the grand jury subpoena first. They needed to lock down the paper trail completely before navigating Malcolm's billion-dollar legal shield. Agent Bennett took a slow step back. He let his hand drop away from the handcuffs on his belt. He looked directly at the lead attorney, refusing to be intimidated. "We are leaving," Agent Bennett said coldly. "But you can tell your client that this investigation is fully active. The fraudulent documents remain in federal custody. We will be back, and next time, no amount of corporate lawyers will stop the arrest warrant." The 2 agents turned and walked out of my office, their heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. The moment the glass doors shut behind them, my father let out a massive, trembling breath of relief. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The sheer terror that had paralyzed him just minutes ago rapidly evaporated, replaced by a sickening, victorious smirk. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "You really thought you had me, Caroline," my father sneered, straightening his suit jacket. "You thought you could send your own father to a federal prison, but you always underestimate Savannah. She always wins. She has the ultimate protection now. She is carrying a billionaire's child. You are nothing but a minor nuisance to a family like ours. Enjoy your empty office." He turned and walked out, flanked by Malcolm's legal team, leaving Ethan and me alone in the silent executive suite. I walked over to my desk and sank into my leather chair. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. Savannah was pregnant. That completely shifted the battlefield. She was no longer just a reckless, embezzling socialite. She had successfully secured her position as the mother of Malcolm's heir. She had anchored herself to his family's wealth and protection in the most permanent way possible. Ethan walked over and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We have the evidence, Caroline. The wire fraud is real. Malcolm's lawyers can only stall the FBI for so long. Once we trace the rest of the missing charity funds, we will bring them all down." Before I could answer, my cell phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of my desk. Then it vibrated again and again. Suddenly, a continuous stream of notifications began flooding my screen. It was not emails from clients or updates from my staff. It was social media alerts, hundreds of them pouring in by the second. I unlocked my phone and opened the trending page. My blood ran completely cold. Savannah had not wasted a single second. Lying in her emergency room bed, she had recorded a live video and broadcast it to her millions of followers. I stared at the screen, watching my sister deliver the performance of a lifetime. She was lying against crisp white hospital pillows. She looked pale, vulnerable, and absolutely terrified. She was clutching her stomach protectively, tears streaming down her flawless face. "I did not want to make this public," Savannah sobbed to the camera, her voice shaking with manufactured trauma. "But I am so scared for my baby." My estranged sister Caroline is a very dark, very jealous person. She has hated me my entire life. Today she orchestrated a fake federal raid on my elderly father just to terrorize my family. The stress was so severe I almost lost my child. She is trying to destroy my life because she is bitter and cruel. Please, I just want my baby to be safe from her. The video ended. The engagement numbers beneath the post were climbing at an astronomical rate. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares. I scrolled through the comment section. It was a digital firing squad. Thousands of strangers were demanding my business be boycotted. People were posting my office address. They were calling me a monster, a psychopath, a jealous failure who deserved to be locked away for terrorizing a pregnant woman. The internet had completely turned its collective unbridled rage entirely on me. Savannah had just launched a nuclear strike on my public reputation, using her unborn child as the ultimate weapon. The digital slaughter of my reputation was not contained to social media for long. By 7 o'clock the next morning, my mother and sister had escalated their coordinated attack to national television. Ethan and I stood in my executive suite, watching the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall. The morning talk show host leaned forward in her plush armchair, her face a picture of exaggerated sympathy. Sitting across from her were Catherine and Savannah. My sister was wearing a modest pastel blue maternity dress that draped perfectly over her supposedly fragile frame. She looked completely exhausted, clinging to my mother's hand, as if she might collapse at any moment. "We tried everything to help Caroline," my mother told the national audience, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. "When she was 18, she fell into a terrible crowd. She struggled with severe substance abuse. We spent our entire life savings trying to get her into rehabilitation facilities, but she chose the streets over her family. We had to practice tough love. Now that she is back in our lives, she is trying to extort us. She is insanely jealous of Savannah's success and her beautiful marriage." Savannah sniffled, touching her stomach with trembling fingers. "I was terrified yesterday," she whispered to the camera. "Caroline sent armed men to my father's office. She demanded money. When I tried to intervene, the stress was so intense that I was rushed to the emergency room. I am carrying the first heir to my husband's family, and my own sister is trying to terrorize me into a miscarriage. I just want her to leave my baby alone. I muted the television. The sheer pathological creativity of their lies was almost impressive. They had weaponized my traumatic eviction, transforming my survival into a fictional battle with drug addiction. They had positioned Savannah as a helpless pregnant victim and painted me as a deranged extortionist. Outside my glass office doors, the fallout was instantaneous and my agency's phone system was entirely lit up in flashing red lights. Every single line was ringing simultaneously. My receptionist was practically in tears. The email servers were overflowing with vitriol. I opened my inbox to find hundreds of death threats pouring in by the minute. Strangers were sending me graphic descriptions of how they wanted to punish me for abusing a pregnant woman. Someone had already published my home address online. Ethan slammed his fist down on my conference table. The heavy thud made the glass rattle. "We are ending this right now," he said, his voice laced with absolute protective fury. "I am calling my contacts at the Wall Street Journal. We are giving them the Monaco casino receipts, the offshore bank transfers, and the forged state filings. I will have the FBI release a statement confirming that William is under active federal investigation for wire fraud. We will bury their television interview by noon." I looked at my husband. His protective instincts as a former federal prosecutor were roaring to the surface. He wanted to hit them with undeniable empirical evidence of their financial crimes. In a courtroom, his strategy would be flawless. But we were not in a courtroom. We were in the court of public opinion, and that was my battlefield. "No," I said quietly, walking over to my desk and opening my encrypted laptop. "If we drop the financial documents right now, it will completely backfire." Ethan stared at me in disbelief. "Caroline, they are destroying your life on national television. Your remaining clients are going to terminate their contracts by the end of the day to avoid the public backlash. We have the proof that Savannah stole $2 million. Why are we holding it back?" "Because she is pregnant," I replied, looking directly at him. "In the eyes of the public, a pregnant woman is untouchable. If I release a complex financial spreadsheet showing offshore bank accounts, the media will not care. They will frame it as a bitter, jealous sister trying to distract the world from the fact that she terrorized a mother-to-be. The public will say I am fabricating financial documents out of spite. Savannah has anchored herself to Malcolm's billionaire legacy. The baby is her ultimate armor. If we want to destroy her narrative, we cannot attack the money yet. We have to shatter her armor." Ethan crossed his arms, his legal mind quickly adapting to my public relations strategy. "So how do we break the armor?" I sat down in my leather chair, my fingers resting on the keyboard. "Savannah is a narcissist," I explained. "And narcissists are notoriously sloppy when they think they have already won. She orchestrated this entire pregnancy narrative perfectly, but she rushed it yesterday when the FBI cornered William. She panicked. And when people panic, they leave digital footprints." I opened my proprietary crisis management database. It was a highly restricted software network that my firm used to conduct deep background checks on corporate rivals and hostile whistleblowers. It bypassed standard search engines and tapped directly into property records, medical licensing boards, and private aviation manifests. "Savannah claimed she was rushed to an emergency room yesterday," I said, my eyes scanning the screen. "But when she was screaming on speakerphone to our father, the sirens in the background sounded distorted. They sounded like a stock audio file, not an active ambulance. Furthermore, Malcolm's legal team showed up at my office less than 20 minutes later. They were too coordinated, too prepared for a sudden medical crisis." I pulled up the high-definition footage Savannah had posted on social media from her hospital bed. I maximized the video on my monitor, pausing the frame exactly when she adjusted her posture. I zoomed in on the pristine white pillowcase behind her head. "Look at the logo embroidered on the edge of the pillow." I pointed to the screen. "That is not the insignia of Northwestern Memorial or any major trauma center in Chicago. That is the logo for the Elysian Wellness Institute. It is an exclusive private boutique clinic in the Gold Coast neighborhood. It caters entirely to wealthy socialites seeking discreet cosmetic procedures and specialized fertility treatments." They do not have an active emergency room for sudden pregnancy traumas. Ethan leaned over my shoulder, staring at the paused video. Why would she stage a life-threatening emergency from a cosmetic boutique clinic instead of a real hospital? Because a real hospital requires actual blood tests, fetal heart monitors, and attending physicians who cannot be bribed. I said, a cold realization settling into my chest. Savannah did not go to a hospital yesterday because she could not risk a random emergency room doctor examining her. I quickly cross-referenced the ownership records for the Elysian Wellness Institute. The property holding company that owned the clinic's building was a subsidiary shell corporation registered in Atlanta. It was directly tied to the commercial real estate portfolio of Malcolm's family trust. I began typing frantically, executing a backdoor search on the chief medical director of the clinic. The results populated on my screen, revealing a web of highly confidential offshore transactions. Savannah was not just using the clinic for her staged video. She had been funneling a portion of the stolen charity funds directly into the private accounts of the clinic's medical director for the past 4 months. Ethan read the screen, his breath catching in his throat. She is paying the doctor. I looked up at my husband, the final piece of the puzzle locking into place. Savannah is not just faking the timeline of this pregnancy, I whispered, my heart pounding with the weight of the discovery. She is faking the bloodline. We just found the key to bringing down her entire empire. I stared at the glowing monitor, the blue light reflecting in Ethan's eyes, as he leaned over my desk. Savannah was not just using the charity money to buy designer bags in Paris. She was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into the private offshore account of the chief medical director at the Elysian Wellness Institute. My fingers flew across the keyboard. In the high-stakes world of crisis public relations, you learn very quickly that wealthy elites use boutique private clinics for exactly 2 things. They use them to hide illicit addictions, or they use them to hide deeply damaging secrets about their genetics. Outside my glass office doors, the fallout from my mother and sister's national television interview was reaching a fever pitch. My agency phone lines were glowing solid red. My receptionist was fielding death threats from strangers who genuinely believed I was a drug-addicted monster terrorizing a helpless pregnant woman. The pressure to release the financial documents and clear my name was immense, but I tuned out the chaos entirely. I needed the final piece of the puzzle to ensure Savannah could never recover from the strike I was preparing. Ethan pulled up a chair next to me, his law enforcement background kicking into absolute overdrive, traced the routing numbers on those clinic payments, he instructed, his voice tight with focused anticipation. If Savannah is paying a prominent doctor off the books, there has to be a secondary ledger. No medical professional risks their license to launder money without keeping a highly guarded insurance file. I routed the search through my agency's encrypted servers, bypassing standard financial firewalls, using specialized tracking software I normally reserved for exposing aggressive corporate espionage. The digital trail led us rapidly away from the Youth Charity Foundation and straight into a sophisticated labyrinth of offshore holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Savannah had set up a primary shell corporation to receive the stolen funds. She thought she was being incredibly clever by burying the account under a series of anonymous corporate layers. But narcissists always leave a fingerprint. She had used her beloved childhood horse as the security question for the password recovery protocol. It was a detail I remembered vividly because my parents had bought her that purebred horse the exact same year they told me we could not afford my high school textbooks. I cracked the holding company's primary ledger, and the screen populated with a dizzying wall of transaction numbers. Ethan let out a sharp, heavy breath. The account balance did not just show the $2 million she had drained from the charity. The total assets sitting in her hidden offshore account amounted to just over $17 million. Where did the rest of this money come from? I asked, my eyes scanning the massive deposits. I highlighted a recurring wire transfer that had been hitting the offshore account on the first of every month for the past 3 years. Ethan leaned closer to the monitor, cross-referencing the routing numbers with a commercial banking database on his own phone. His jaw dropped. Caroline, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. Those wire transfers are originating from Atlanta. They are coming directly out of the primary commercial real estate holding trust owned by Malcolm's family. Savannah did not just steal from her little charity foundation. She has been systematically siphoning $15 million out of her husband's generational wealth. The sheer magnitude of her crime was staggering. Savannah had positioned herself as the perfect devoted high society wife while quietly bleeding a billionaire dynasty dry. She had orchestrated an invisible ongoing heist right under the nose of a man who commanded absolute authority. But the massive theft raised an immediate glaring question. Why was she pouring so much of that stolen money into a boutique fertility clinic in Chicago instead of just keeping it offshore? I needed to get inside the Elysian Wellness Institute's private records without triggering a cybersecurity alarm. I picked up my phone and called a contact I had cultivated over a decade in the media industry. He was a highly specialized investigative journalist who owed me a massive career-saving favor after I shielded his news network from a catastrophic defamation lawsuit 3 years ago. I did not give him the full context of my request. I simply told him I needed the blind billing architecture for the clinic's VIP client list. Within 20 minutes, a heavily encrypted data file dropped into my secure inbox. My hands were actually shaking slightly as I typed in the decryption keys. The file unzipped to reveal the private itemized medical invoices for Savannah's treatment at the clinic over the past 12 months. I bypassed the standard cosmetic procedures and went straight for the reproductive department billing codes. The screen displayed a series of highly specialized, incredibly expensive fertility treatments. Ethan placed his hands flat on my desk, his eyes narrowing as he read the clinical descriptions. She did not just go to this clinic for routine pregnancy ultrasounds, Ethan stated, pointing at a specific sequence of billing codes. She underwent a highly complex in vitro fertilization procedure. She paid the medical director an exorbitant premium in stolen cash to fast-track the process and keep the records completely off the main hospital grid. I scrolled down to the very bottom of the invoice, where the genetic material donors were listed. Malcolm's name was nowhere on the official medical document. The clinic had sourced the required genetic material from a highly screened anonymous private donor. I sat back in my leather chair, the absolute weight of the discovery crashing over me and silencing the chaotic noise of the office outside. The baby she was currently carrying, the child she had just used on national television to shield herself from a federal indictment, the supposed third-generation heir to a billion-dollar Atlanta real estate empire. Savannah was completely faking the bloodline. The baby did not belong to Malcolm. The heavy laser printer in my office hummed to life, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the executive suite. I watched the crisp white pages slide into the output tray one by one. Each sheet of paper bore the damning medical billing codes and the hidden offshore financial ledgers. This was the absolute undeniable proof. Savannah had stolen $15 million from a billionaire family trust and used a fraction of it to purchase anonymous genetic material. The highly anticipated heir to Malcolm's vast real estate empire was a complete biological fraud. I gathered the warm papers and placed them inside a bright red, tamper-proof dossier folder. In the high-stakes crisis public relations industry, physical hard copies of nuclear evidence are just as important as digital backups. Ethan remained at my desk, his fingers flying across my computer keyboard. He was initiating a highly encrypted cloud backup of the entire data breach. He needed another 20 minutes to bounce the agency servers through a secure virtual private network, so Savannah's offshore hackers could not wipe our hard drives overnight. I told my husband I was heading down to the underground executive parking garage. I needed to lock the physical dossier inside the steel biometric safe welded into the trunk of my car. You never leave hard copies of a financial crime sitting on an office desk. I stepped out of the private elevator into the subterranean parking structure. The air down here was damp and freezing, smelling faintly of motor oil and cold concrete. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows across the empty parking bays. My heels clicked loudly against the pavement, the sound echoing in the deserted cavern. I was 20 feet away from my vehicle when the screeching of heavy tires shattered the quiet. A massive black SUV with heavily tinted windows sped around the concrete pillar, its high beams flipping on and temporarily blinding me. The vehicle slammed on its brakes, swerving aggressively to block my direct path to my car. My pulse spiked, but I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady. I clutched the red folder tightly to my chest. The front doors of the SUV flew open. Two enormous men stepped out into the harsh garage lighting. They wore dark tactical jackets and moved with the silent, predatory grace of expensive street mercenaries. They did not look like standard corporate security guards. These were hired muscle men paid in untraceable cash to do things that left permanent scars. They flanked me immediately, cutting off my route back to the safety of the elevator bank. I stood my ground, my eyes darting between the two towering thugs. Then the rear passenger doors of the SUV slowly opened. My father William stepped out onto the cold concrete. He adjusted the lapels of his expensive wool coat, his face set in a grim, violent scowl. My mother Catherine followed close behind him. She had a heavy silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck to ward off the chill of the garage. They looked down at me with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "You really thought you were the only one who knows how to play the surveillance game," Caroline, my father said, his voice echoing menacingly against the concrete walls. "You think Savannah is stupid enough to pay a corrupt fertility doctor millions of dollars without putting a security tripwire on her own medical files?" I tightened my grip on the red folder. The realization hit me instantly. The chief medical director at the Elysian Wellness Institute had installed tracking software on his private patient database. The moment I breached his firewall to download the IVF records, an alert had been sent directly to my sister. They knew exactly what I had just discovered. Catherine stepped forward, her expensive heels crunching on a piece of loose gravel. She looked at the hired muscles standing on either side of me, then looked back at my face with a wicked, triumphant sneer. "We are not going to let you ruin this family," my mother hissed, her eyes completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "Savannah is carrying a child that guarantees us access to $1 billion dynasty. Do you have any idea what Malcolm would do if he found out that baby does not share his bloodline? He would annihilate Savannah. He would take back every single penny she transferred to her offshore accounts. We would be left with nothing." My father pointed a trembling, furious finger at my chest. "You are going to hand over that red folder right now," William demanded. "And then you are going to walk back upstairs and delete every digital file you just downloaded. Because if you ever breathe a single word to Malcolm about the stolen $15 million or the baby's true father, these gentlemen standing next to you are going to pay a visit to your husband." The threat hung in the freezing air, heavy and lethal. "Ethan is a former federal prosecutor," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "If you send hired thugs after my husband, you will not just face wire fraud charges. You will spend the rest of your natural lives in a federal penitentiary." My mother laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound that bounced off the concrete ceiling. "You think we care about federal laws right now, Caroline? We are fighting for our survival. Malcolm's family has enough money to buy and sell this entire city. If we lose our connection to his wealth, we lose everything. We will burn your agency to the ground. We will physically destroy your husband. We will do whatever it takes to protect Savannah's position." William took a step closer, his face twisted with desperate rage. "You are entirely out of your league. We have the muscle. We have the billionaire protection. You have nothing but a failing public relations firm and a frozen bank account." My mother crossed her arms, her cruel smile returning in full force. "You are going to watch the television tomorrow morning, Caroline. Malcolm has arranged a massive live press conference at his downtown hotel. Savannah is going to take the podium. She is going to look into the cameras and officially label you as a deranged extortionist sister who terrorized her unborn child." Catherine leaned in close, lowering her voice to a vicious whisper. "You will be publicly ruined forever. Your clients will despise you. The world will view you as a monster. And if you try to fight back, if you try to release those medical records, we will unleash these men on your family." They expected me to tremble. They expected me to drop the red folder onto the pavement, fall to my knees, and surrender to their violent intimidation. They thought the threat of physical harm and complete public humiliation would finally break the daughter they had discarded 15 years ago. I looked at the two massive thugs blocking my path. I looked at my father, who was sweating despite the freezing temperature of the garage. I looked at my mother, who was desperately clinging to a web of incredibly fragile lies. I did not drop the folder. I did not step back. I simply stood in the shadows of the parking garage, looking directly into my mother's eyes, and I smirked. My smirk seemed to genuinely confuse my mother. She had anticipated tears begging or a frantic attempt to run. Instead, I stood completely still in the freezing underground garage, clutching the red dossier to my chest. The two massive hired mercenaries shifted uneasily. Men who operate in the violent shadows have a sixth sense for when a trap is about to spring. Before my father could open his mouth to demand the folder again, the heavy steel door to the emergency stairwell crashed open. Ethan stepped out onto the concrete landing. He was not alone. Flanking my husband were three armed off-duty Chicago police officers who moonlighted as executive protection for my agency during high-risk corporate disputes. Ethan held his phone up the screen, glowing brightly in the dim light. The recording timer was already ticking past 3 minutes. "I think we have heard enough," Ethan projected his voice across the parking garage. "As a former federal prosecutor, I can tell you that cornering a witness in a dark garage to suppress evidence of a federal crime is a textbook violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. I already transmitted the live audio of this entire conversation to my secure server. If anyone takes a single step toward my wife, these officers will place you under arrest for felony witness tampering and assault." The hired mercenaries immediately backed down. They were paid to intimidate corporate rivals, not to engage in a shootout with armed police officers while being recorded for a federal indictment. They lowered their hands and took several deliberate steps away from me, signaling they wanted no part of this escalating disaster. My father turned pale, the false bravado draining from his face as his hired muscle abandoned him. My mother clutched her silk scarf, her eyes darting between the armed officers and the glowing screen of Ethan's phone. "You are going to regret this," Catherine hissed, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and unyielding spite. "You think you are so smart, Caroline. But tomorrow morning, Malcolm is holding a live press conference at his downtown hotel. Savannah is going to take the podium. She is going to cry for the cameras and tell the entire country that you are a deranged, jealous monster who tried to extort a pregnant woman. Every major news network will be broadcasting it live. You will not be able to show your face in this city ever again." I walked past her, protected by the perimeter Ethan and the officers had established. I popped the trunk of my car, pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of the steel safe welded inside, and locked the red dossier away. "I will be sure to tune in," I said without looking back. We left them standing in the damp, freezing garage. Ethan and I drove straight to our high-rise penthouse. We did not sleep a single minute that night. The stakes were too high. My mother was right about one thing. A live, nationally televised press conference hosted by a billionaire real estate heir would command absolute media dominance. If Savannah controlled the narrative for even 1 hour, my agency would be permanently destroyed. And the truth about her stolen $15 million and the fake bloodline would be buried under a mountain of public outrage. We transformed our dining room into a digital war room, while Ethan coordinated with his legal contacts to prepare the inevitable federal injunctions. I used my elite crisis public relations network to execute a highly classified maneuver. In my industry, information is ammunition and access is everything. I bypassed the standard media channels and tapped directly into the credential registry for Malcolm's upcoming press conference. I downloaded the contact information for every single journalist, news anchor, and media outlet that had RSVP'd to the event. I compiled a massive targeted distribution list. Then I began building the ultimate digital strike payload. I digitized the offshore bank statements, showing Savannah siphoning $15 million from Malcolm's family trust. I uploaded the forged state filings that my parents had used to frame me as the charity's dummy executive. And finally, I attached the medical billing codes from the Elysian Wellness Institute, proving undeniably that the genetic material for Savannah's highly publicized pregnancy was purchased from an anonymous private donor. I linked the entire encrypted payload to a single mass distribution email. All it required was one tap of my finger, and the undeniable truth would detonate directly into the pockets of every reporter in the country. The sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline, casting a harsh, pale light into our penthouse. My stomach tightened with a cold, heavy anxiety. The morning news programs were already teasing the upcoming press conference. The chyrons at the bottom of the television screen read, "Billionaire heir to address cyber attack by pregnant wife's sister." Savannah's manufactured victim narrative was dominating the morning cycle. Ethan walked up behind me and placed his hands on my shoulders, massaging the tension tight in my muscles. "We have everything we need," he said quietly. "Are you ready to do this?" I closed my laptop and stood up. I walked into my closet and selected my armor. A sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit. I applied my makeup with meticulous precision, ensuring there was absolutely no sign of exhaustion, fear, or defeat on my face. I was not the scared 18-year-old girl they had thrown out into the rain. I was the architect of their impending destruction. Ethan drove me to the luxury hotel in the heart of downtown Chicago. The perimeter of the building was swarming with Malcolm's private security detail and a sea of media broadcast vans. The sidewalk was a chaotic mess of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Using my premium crisis management credentials, I bypassed the outer security checkpoints through a service corridor I had used for corporate events a dozen times before. The guards at the side entrance assumed I was part of the hotel's event management staff. I moved with quiet, invisible purpose. I pushed open the heavy velvet-lined doors and slipped into the grand ballroom. The space was packed shoulder to shoulder with aggressive journalists and glaring camera lights. I stood in the deep shadows at the very back of the room, completely unnoticed by the crowd. On the brightly lit stage at the front of the hall, the heavy curtains parted. Malcolm stepped out into the blinding flash of the press cameras. I was followed closely by my father, my mother, and finally Savannah. She was wearing a soft white dress, holding a tissue, and resting a protective hand over her stomach. She looked absolutely ready to destroy my life on national television. I stood in the dark, my phone unlocked in my hand, my thumb hovering directly over the send button, waiting for my sister to take the podium. The grand ballroom of the downtown hotel was practically vibrating with the collective energy of 300 journalists. Rows of heavy television cameras formed a mechanical, impenetrable wall at the center of the room. The blinding white strobe lights flashed in a continuous, erratic rhythm, illuminating the gold leaf architecture of the ceiling. I remained perfectly still in the velvet-draped shadows near the rear service exit. My dark charcoal suit blended seamlessly into the dim lighting of the back wall. I breathed in the scent of expensive hotel floral arrangements and ozone from the heavy broadcasting equipment, waiting for the execution to begin. Up on the brightly illuminated stage, Malcolm approached the clear acrylic podium. He adjusted the microphone with a calm, imposing authority. The low roar of the press corps instantly died down into an expectant, heavy silence. When a billionaire real estate heir calls a sudden national press conference to address a severe cyber attack on his pregnant wife, the media pays absolute attention. Malcolm looked out over the sea of reporters. His expression was a flawless mask of grim determination. He spoke briefly about the sanctity of family, the importance of his commercial empire, and the extreme lengths he would go to protect his estate from malicious interference. Then, with a slow, protective gesture, he stepped back from the microphone and invited his wife to speak. Savannah walked slowly to the podium. She was giving the absolute performance of her life. She wore a soft, uncharacteristically modest white maternity dress that clung perfectly to her slightly rounded stomach. Her golden blonde hair was pulled back into a simple, elegant clip. Her face was deliberately devoid of her usual heavy contouring, specifically designed by a stylist to make her look pale, exhausted, and incredibly vulnerable. My mother and father stepped up to stand just a few feet behind her, wearing matching expressions of deep parental distress. Savannah gripped the edges of the acrylic podium. Her hands were visibly shaking. She leaned into the microphone and let out a soft, shuddering breath that echoed powerfully through the massive ballroom speakers. "Thank you all for coming," Savannah began, her voice trembling with manufactured trauma. "As a mother-to-be, my only priority right now is the safety of my unborn child. But over the past 48 hours, my family has been subjected to a relentless, terrifying campaign of criminal extortion." The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every simulated tear that welled up in her eyes and spilled down her pale cheeks. Savannah placed one hand protectively over her stomach, a gesture perfectly calculated to elicit maximum public sympathy. The person orchestrating this terror is not a random corporate cybercriminal. It is my own estranged sister, Caroline. 15 years ago, she chose a life of dark addiction and rebellion over our family. My parents sacrificed their life savings trying to save her, but she turned her back on us. We gave her money to start a new life and she squandered it. Now, seeing the beautiful, stable life I have built with my husband, she has returned with a heart full of jealousy and pure malice. My mother. Catherine stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on Savannah's shoulder. It was a flawlessly choreographed display of maternal support. My father, William, stood tall with his chest puffed out, looking like the fierce, protective patriarch he never actually was. Yesterday, Savannah sobbed, leaning closer to the microphones so her breaking voice could be heard clearly by the national television audience. Caroline sent armed mercenaries to my father's private office. She demanded millions of dollars, threatening to release fabricated financial documents to destroy my youth education charity foundation. When we refused to pay her massive extortion demands, she launched a vicious cyber attack against our accounts. The stress of her physical threats was so severe that I was rushed to the emergency room in an ambulance. She is trying to terrorize me into losing my baby. I just want her to leave my family alone. The reporters immediately began shouting questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy of journalistic bloodlust. They demanded to know if federal charges had been filed, if I was currently in police custody, and if Malcolm's family was taking aggressive legal action to protect their unborn heir. Savannah held up a trembling hand to quiet the room. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes scanning the expansive ballroom. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew I was in the room, because my mother had promised I would be watching my own destruction. Savannah's gaze swept over the crowded floor, deliberately searching the deep shadows at the back of the hall. Then her eyes locked directly onto mine. A cruel, victorious glint flashed in her eyes for a fraction of a second before she morphed her face back into a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. She let out a loud, theatrical gasp, stumbling backward slightly against my mother, and pointed a shaking finger straight at me. "She is here!" Savannah screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill with fake escalating panic. "She is standing right there in the back. Please, somebody keep her away from me. She is unstable and dangerous." The entire ballroom pivoted violently. 300 heads turned in perfect unison. The heavy television cameras whipped around on their tripods, their bright red recording lights locking onto my position in the shadows. A massive wall of blinding, searing white light hit me, as every photographer in the room aimed their flashes at the back wall. The media descended like starving wolves. Reporters shoved each other out of the way, sprinting down the center aisle toward me. They thrust digital recorders and heavy microphones directly into my face. They shouted aggressive, overlapping questions about drug addiction, corporate extortion, and whether I felt any remorse for violently attacking a pregnant woman. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure designed to break anyone caught in its center. Suddenly, the aggressive shouts of the journalists were drowned out by the booming voices of Malcolm's private security detail. 6 massive men in black suits pushed violently through the crowd, shoving reporters aside without hesitation. They formed a tight, hostile semicircle around me, trapping me against the velvet-draped wall. They were not there to protect me from the press. They were there to physically drag me out of the building and complete my absolute public humiliation. Up on the stage, through the glaring camera lights and the sea of aggressive reporters, I could clearly see my parents. My mother was smiling openly now, her facade of distress entirely forgotten in the thrill of the moment. My father looked down at me with absolute undisguised triumph. They had successfully cornered their scapegoat. They had thrown me to the wolves on live national television, cementing their own false narrative forever. They thought I was completely destroyed. I stood perfectly still, surrounded by screaming journalists and advancing security guards. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to shield my face from the blinding camera flashes. I did not utter a single word of defense or try to push the microphones away. Instead, I slowly raised my cell phone into the air, holding it up where the television cameras could clearly capture the glowing screen. I ignored the shouting reporters. I ignored the massive security guards stepping into my personal space. I ignored my gloating parents and Savannah's pathetic sobbing performance at the podium. I looked straight over the chaotic, noisy crowd and locked my eyes directly onto Malcolm, who was still standing tall and silent at the center of the stage. For one brief, electrifying second, the billionaire real estate heir and the crisis public relations consultant held a silent, unwavering gaze across the massive, brightly lit ballroom. Without breaking eye contact with my brother-in-law, I pressed my thumb firmly down on the screen and hit send. My thumb lifted off the smooth glass of my phone screen. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the massive ballroom remained suspended in total chaos. The heavy security guards were still advancing, their large hands reaching out to grab my shoulders and physically drag me out of the building. The aggressive journalists were still shouting their hostile questions directly into my face, fully believing the narrative that I was a deranged, jealous monster attacking a helpless pregnant woman. My mother and father stood on the brightly lit stage, their faces glowing with arrogant triumph as they watched my public execution unfold. Then the digital strike landed. It started as a single sharp ping from a reporter standing in the front row. A split second later, a massive cascade of chimes, buzzes, and customized ringtones erupted across the entire room. 300 mobile phones, tablets, and laptops received my encrypted payload at the exact same millisecond. The sheer volume of the simultaneous notifications echoed through the cavernous ballroom like a synchronized alarm. The hostile energy directed at me instantly vanished, replaced by the raw, predatory reflex of the National Press Corps. The journalists stopped shouting. They lowered their microphones and ripped their phones from their pockets, their eyes urgently scanning the incoming email blast. The subject line I had drafted was impossible to ignore. It read, "Official financial audit and protected medical records for the Savannah Trust." I had intentionally coded the attached audio files to preview and play automatically upon opening, before anyone could even process the massive offshore bank ledgers or the falsified state documents. The arrogant, undeniable voice of my sister echoed from a journalist's phone near the center aisle. Savannah was not crying on the recording, she was laughing. "I transferred another 500,000 to the private clinic today," Savannah's recorded voice boasted. The sound carried through the sudden, stunned silence of the ballroom. The medical director guaranteed he will alter the genetic profile records on the private server. Malcolm will never know the baby comes from an anonymous donor. His family thinks they are so invincible, but they are completely blind. Once this baby is born, my position in the trust is permanently secured. We can funnel out another 20 million before the end of the fiscal year. A collective shockwave ripped through the crowd, but the digital payload was not finished. My mother's voice joined the recording next, her tone calculating and vicious. "Make sure you wipe the transaction history cleanly," Catherine instructed on the tape. "We already took 15 million from the holding company. If we bleed Malcolm's trust any faster right now, his accountants will notice the missing liquid capital. I already sent the guys to the underground parking garage to deal with your sister. Caroline will not say a single word to anyone once those men are finished terrorizing her." More reporters hit play on their devices. Soon the damning conversation was playing from dozens of different speakers, simultaneously creating a horrific, overlapping chorus of my sister and my mother, exposing their ultimate betrayal. The recorded voices discussed forging DNA tests, stealing generational wealth, and hiring violent mercenaries to physically silence a family member. The security guards who had surrounded me froze in their tracks. They slowly lowered their hands and took several deliberate steps backward. Their earpieces were buzzing with frantic orders from their command center, but they realized instantly that I was not a physical threat. I was the architect of the biggest corporate and social scandal of the decade, and I had just handed the media the murder weapon. I simply stood against the velvet wall watching my handiwork detonate. Up on the stage, the perfectly constructed illusion completely shattered. Savannah stared down at the press pool in absolute paralyzing horror. The color drained from her face so rapidly she looked physically ill. Her hands flew away from her stomach. She lunged forward, grabbing the clear acrylic podium to keep her balance. "It is fake!" Savannah screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and desperate, cracking under the immense weight of her collapsing lies. "Do not listen to it. Caroline used artificial intelligence to fabricate that audio. It is a deep fake. She is framing me. Someone turn the internet off. Turn it off right now." But the journalists were already scrolling past the audio files and opening the hard financial evidence. They saw the Cayman Island wire transfers perfectly matching the dates of her clinic visits. They saw the unredacted medical billing codes from the Elysian Wellness Institute, proving the purchase of anonymous genetic material. They saw the undeniable empirical proof of a $15 million heist and a fraudulent bloodline. The reporters surged forward, rushing the stage like a tidal wave. They completely abandoned their sympathetic narrative of a helpless pregnant woman. They aimed their cameras directly at Savannah and began shouting brutal, targeted questions. "Is it true the baby does not belong to your husband?" A reporter from a major financial network shouted over the noise. "Did you steal $15 million from the family trust to pay for illegal fertility treatments?" My father, William, took a terrified step backward, his chest heaving as the reality of his impending federal arrest finally crushed the last remaining ounce of his pride. He looked like a man who knew the FBI was already waiting outside the doors. My mother, Catherine, tried to grab Savannah's arm to pull her away from the podium, but her golden child was frozen in shock, gripping the edges of the stand as the media tore her reputation to shreds. Through the blinding flashes of the cameras and the deafening roar of the press pool, I kept my eyes locked on the center of the stage. Malcolm stood perfectly still amidst the swirling panic of his in-laws. He did not look at the shouting journalists. He did not look at the financial documents being waved in the air by the reporters. He slowly reached up and detached his microphone from the podium stand. He lowered it to his side with steady, measured precision. Then Malcolm turned to look at his weeping, frantic wife. His dark eyes were completely dead. His face held absolutely no shock, no betrayal, and no heartbreak. As the entire world crashed down around Savannah, the billionaire real estate heir did not look surprised at all. Savannah reached out with trembling hands, her knuckles white as she desperately tried to grab the lapels of Malcolm's custom-tailored suit. She was crying hysterically now, abandoning the microphone to beg her husband for salvation. She pleaded with him to protect her from the journalists swearing on her life, that the audio recordings playing throughout the ballroom were sophisticated cyber fabrications. Malcolm did not flinch. He did not offer her a comforting embrace or whisper words of reassurance. He simply took one deliberate step backward, allowing Savannah's hands to swipe at empty air. He looked at the woman he had been married to for 5 years as if he were staring at an absolute stranger. Then Malcolm did something that made the blood freeze in my mother's veins. He looked past his weeping wife, past the frantic horde of reporters, and locked his dark eyes directly onto me, where I stood in the deep shadows of the rear exit. Slowly and deliberately, the billionaire real estate heir bowed his head in a sharp, respectful nod. Savannah caught the movement. She whipped her head around her tear-streaked face, twisting in absolute confusion as she followed her husband's line of sight straight to me. My mother and father saw the silent exchange as well. The arrogant triumph that had illuminated their faces just moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden suffocating horror. They were finally beginning to realize that they were not the predators in this scenario. They were the prey. The entire chaotic sequence of the past 48 hours had been nothing but a meticulously choreographed trap, and I was the architect who designed it. The true story did not begin at the charity gala last night. It began exactly 6 months ago inside a highly secure private boardroom at the top of a skyscraper in downtown Chicago. 6 months ago, the patriarch of the Atlanta real estate empire, Malcolm's father, quietly flew into the city under an alias. The patriarch had spent decades building a billion-dollar commercial dynasty, and men of his caliber possess a ruthless instinct for detecting financial parasites. He had noticed subtle, unexplainable hemorrhaging in a secondary family trust. The discrepancies were incredibly sophisticated, buried under layers of corporate red tape, but Savannah's name kept appearing near the margins of the bleeding accounts. The patriarch could not simply hurl accusations at his own daughter-in-law without risking a catastrophic, highly publicized family civil war. He needed undeniable empirical proof. He needed someone who could operate in the absolute shadows, someone who understood how to navigate elite corporate scandals, and most importantly, someone who understood exactly how Savannah's manipulative mind functioned. He did not hire a standard private investigator. He hired my crisis public relations firm, I sat across from Malcolm and his powerful father in that secure boardroom half a year ago. Malcolm had been devastated by the preliminary financial findings, but his loyalty to his family's legacy ultimately outweighed the toxic illusion of his marriage. I told them that confronting Savannah directly would yield nothing but theatrical tears and gaslighting. I explained that narcissists like my sister and my parents never confess when they are accused. They only confess when they believe they have achieved absolute untouchable power. To catch them, we had to starve them of oxygen, back them into a corner, and then hand them a loaded weapon. Every single terrifying event over the past 2 days was a calculated maneuver in our joint sting operation. The confrontation at the charity gala was the opening act. When Malcolm stormed the ballroom with his security guards and demanded I hand over my crisis management firm, it was pure theater. We needed Savannah and my parents to believe they had successfully weaponized a billionaire against me. We needed them to feel completely invincible. When my business accounts were frozen at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, the panic in my office was entirely real because my employees did not know the truth. But Ethan and I knew. Days before the injunction was filed, Ethan had utilized his federal prosecution contacts to quietly route my agency's actual operating capital into a secure, untouchable federal escrow account. My clients who canceled their contracts were actually dummy corporations managed by Malcolm's team. The financial siege was a terrifying illusion designed to make my family drop their guard. It worked flawlessly. Believing I was completely ruined and desperate, my father strutted into my office to claim my company. Believing I was entirely defenseless, my parents ambushed me in the freezing parking garage with hired muscle. They were so intoxicated by their perceived victory that they openly discussed their crimes on a recorded line, completely unaware that Ethan and the off-duty police officers were standing just a few feet away, collecting the final pieces of audio evidence required for a federal indictment. Back in the brightly lit ballroom, the National Press Corps was practically vibrating with adrenaline. The journalists were rapidly connecting the dots between the offshore bank ledgers on their phones and the unfolding drama on the stage. Malcolm slowly raised his microphone back to his mouth. The room instantly fell silent again. For the past 6 months, Malcolm's deep voice echoed across the massive hall. My family trust has been cooperating with a private independent investigation into severe financial irregularities. Today, the results of that investigation have been brought to light. Effective immediately, I am filing for a complete dissolution of my marriage, and my legal team is transferring all gathered evidence of embezzlement directly to the federal authorities. Savannah let out a guttural, agonizing scream. She grabbed the microphone stand, her knuckles turning stark white. "You cannot do this to me," Malcolm Savannah shrieked, abandoning all pretense of composure. She pointed a frantic, trembling finger at her stomach. "I am your wife. I am carrying your child. You are abandoning your own bloodline over a misunderstanding. I did it for us." Malcolm looked down at the woman who had spent 5 years treating my life like collateral damage. He did not show a single ounce of mercy. His voice was as cold and hard as concrete. "We both know that child does not share a single drop of my blood." Savannah Malcolm stated, his words slicing through the heavy air of the ballroom. "Your medical invoices from the Elysian Wellness Institute were included in the digital file distributed to the press. You purchased anonymous genetic material to secure your position in my estate. You are a fraud and you are entirely out of time." My mother collapsed onto the stage, her knees hitting the polished wood as the absolute reality of their destruction finally set in. My father stumbled backward, his face gray with terror, his eyes darting wildly toward the side exits. But it was too late to run. The heavy wooden doors at the front of the ballroom slammed open, and a line of uniformed police officers marched aggressively down the center aisle, their handcuffs gleaming under the bright television lights. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the grand ballroom crashed against the walls with a violent, echoing thud. The sea of shouting journalists and flashing cameras instantly parted like the Red Sea. Marching aggressively down the center aisle was not another team of private corporate security guards. It was a highly coordinated strike force of uniformed Chicago police officers, accompanied by 2 stern-looking federal investigators wearing tactical jackets. The bright television lights caught the gleam of the heavy steel handcuffs hanging from the lead detective's belt. The media completely lost their minds. The press pool erupted into a deafening roar of overlapping questions, cameras shuddering frantically to capture the unprecedented spectacle of law enforcement raiding a billionaire's live press conference. Up on the stage, the perfectly curated illusion of my family finally shattered into pieces. Savannah stood frozen behind the clear acrylic podium. Her hands were still resting protectively over her stomach, but her manufactured tears had completely dried up. Her face was stark white, devoid of any color as she watched the armed officers march up the side steps and onto the brightly lit stage. She looked around wildly, searching for an escape route, but Malcolm's private security detail had subtly shifted their formation. They were no longer guarding the perimeter to keep the press away. They were blocking the rear exit to ensure my sister could not run. The lead detective stepped directly in front of Savannah. He did not care about the hundreds of cameras broadcasting his face to a national audience. He did not care that she was wearing a custom couture maternity dress or that she was standing next to a prominent real estate tycoon. Savannah the detective set his voice booming through the microphone still active on the podium. You are under arrest for grand larceny, interstate wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Savannah let out a guttural, terrifying shriek. She lunged backward, stumbling in her expensive heels. She threw her hands up, frantically shaking her head as if the sheer force of her denial could somehow rewrite reality. Get away from me! Savannah screamed, her voice cracking as the officers moved in. You cannot touch me. I am pregnant. I am having a medical emergency. Malcolm, tell them to stop. Tell your lawyers to make them leave right now. The officers did not hesitate. Two uniformed cops stepped forward, grasping my sister by the arms. They swiftly turned her around. The sharp, unmistakable click of the metal handcuffs locking securely around her wrists echoed over the ballroom speakers. The cold steel looked incredibly harsh against the soft white fabric of her designer maternity dress. My mother let out a horrific wailing sound. Catherine threw herself forward, completely abandoning any remaining shred of high society dignity. She tried to physically wedge herself between the police officers and her golden child. Take your hands off my daughter! Catherine cried out, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. She is innocent. Caroline set this up. This is a setup. You are arresting the wrong person. One of the federal agents stepped firmly into my mother's path, holding his hand up in a strict authoritative gesture that demanded immediate compliance. Step back immediately, or you will be detained for interfering with a federal arrest. The agent warned, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. My father, William, realized the physical intervention was useless. His chest was heaving, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He saw the flashing cameras capturing his family's utter destruction. He knew his own federal indictment for forging my corporate documents was imminent. Desperate, frantic, and completely out of options, William turned his attention to the only man in the room who possessed enough power to stop the slaughter. William rushed over to Malcolm. He reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his son-in-law's expensive bespoke suit. Malcolm, please. William begged, his voice trembling with sheer panic. You have to call your legal team. You have judges in your pocket. You have the connections. You cannot let them drag Savannah out of here in handcuffs. She is carrying your child. Think about the baby. Malcolm slowly turned his head to look at the man who had tried to steal my public relations agency just a few hours earlier. Malcolm's dark eyes were completely dead, devoid of any warmth or mercy. I already addressed the bloodline. William, Malcolm stated, his deep voice carrying easily over the chaotic noise of the press room. I read the medical files. I saw the offshore transactions. Savannah bought anonymous genetic material to trap my family. That child is nothing to me. My mother heard the rejection and scrambled over to join my father. She fell to her knees right there on the stage, the rough wood scraping against her expensive silk skirt. She looked up at the billionaire heir, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. We will pay you back, Malcolm. Catherine pleaded, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. We will cover the stolen $15 million. We will pay back every single cent Savannah took from your family trust. Just post her bail. Just get her out of police custody before the media ruins us permanently. We have assets. William nodded frantically, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the exit. Yes, we have assets. Use our mansion in the suburbs as collateral to post the bail bond. Call the bank right now, Malcolm. We will put up the entire estate. We will sign the deed over to you today. Just save our daughter. The police officers began walking Savannah toward the edge of the stage. She was thrashing wildly in her handcuffs, screaming for my parents to save her, screaming that she was a victim. The blinding camera flashes captured every agonizing second of her humiliating descent. Malcolm stood perfectly still amidst the screaming and the chaos. He reached up with slow, deliberate precision and adjusted his platinum cufflinks. He looked down at my weeping mother and my trembling father. A cold, unapologetic smirk crossed his face. "Your mansion?" Malcolm asked, his voice dripping with absolute lethal irony. He leaned in slightly, ensuring my parents heard every single word over the deafening roar of the ballroom. "You transferred the deed of your mansion to my holding company last week to pay for Caroline's fake public relations firm, remember? You handed over your entire estate to settle a debt you thought you had negotiated. You do not own that house anymore, William. In fact, the bank is foreclosing on it as we speak." 3 days later, a brutal rainstorm battered the city of Chicago. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury penthouse, I watched the heavy gray clouds swallow the skyline and rain lash against the reinforced glass. I was safe, warm, and completely victorious. My public relations agency had effortlessly weathered the brief media storm, and my team was already negotiating a massive permanent retainer with Malcolm's family trust. But just a few miles away, on the desolate outskirts of the city, the reality of absolute unmitigated ruin was crashing down on the people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. Through Ethan's network of federal law enforcement contacts and my own elite media sources, I received a perfectly detailed timeline of my family's spectacular downfall. The devastation had been instantaneous. The moment the police escorted Savannah off the stage in handcuffs, Malcolm unleashed his corporate legal team with terrifying precision. He did not just foreclose on my parents' sprawling suburban mansion. He legally seized every single physical asset tied to the holding company he controlled. When William and Catherine fled the chaotic press conference and attempted to return to their estate, they found the massive iron gates padlocked. A team of private security contractors stood in the driveway holding a court-ordered eviction notice. My parents were not even allowed inside to pack their designer clothes, their expensive jewelry, or their prized artwork. They were locked out in the cold with absolutely nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Their luxury vehicles, which had been leased through Savannah's fraudulent charity foundation, were towed away by federal agents before the sun even set. By the second day, their social exile was entirely complete. Catherine had spent hours standing in the lobby of a downtown bank, frantically dialing the numbers of her wealthy high society friends. She called the wives of state senators, real estate developers, and corporate executives, desperately seeking a temporary place to stay or a short-term loan to hire a criminal defense attorney. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The elite society women, who used to drink expensive champagne with my mother, had blocked her number completely. Nobody in the city of Chicago wanted to be associated with a family that had been publicly exposed for stealing $15 million and faking a billionaire bloodline. The ultimate humiliation arrived when my parents attempted to seek refuge at their prestigious country club. They were stopped at the front entrance by the club manager, who handed them a formal, legally drafted letter. The board of directors had unanimously voted to revoke their lifetime membership, citing a strict violation of their moral conduct clause. Ethan told me that Catherine actually wept in the parking lot over that letter. She cried harder over losing her elite country club status than she did over the fact that her golden child was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. Savannah was trapped in a maximum security detention center. The federal judge overseeing her arraignment had deemed my sister a severe flight risk, given her extensive network of hidden offshore bank accounts. Bail was set at an astronomical figure that my parents could not even begin to comprehend, let alone afford. Savannah was facing 20 years in federal prison for grand larceny, interstate wire fraud, and money laundering. The daughter they had shielded from every consequence, the golden child they had sacrificed me to protect, was now completely powerless. She could not save them. By the third day, the sheer panic of true poverty finally broke them. William and Catherine were forced to rent a room in a cheap, dilapidated motel near the industrial train yards. The roof leaked dripping muddy water onto a stained, worn carpet that smelled heavily of cheap bleach and stale cigarette smoke. The flickering neon sign outside their window cast a sickly red glow across the cramped room. William paced the narrow space between the sagging mattress and the peeling wallpaper. His expensive Italian wool suit was deeply wrinkled and stained from 3 days of continuous wear. He aggressively tapped the screen of his cell phone, checking his mobile banking application for the 100th time, praying for a miracle. The balance remained at absolute zero. The federal authorities had officially frozen his personal accounts, pending their own aggressive investigation into the forged corporate documents he had used to try and steal my public relations agency. "We have absolutely nothing left," Catherine, my father, muttered, tossing his useless phone onto the cheap laminate nightstand. He rubbed his hands over his exhausted, unshaven face. "Malcolm took the house. The government froze the banks. We do not even have enough cash to pay for another week in this miserable room. What are we supposed to do?" My mother sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, wrapped in her damp trench coat. She was shivering as the drafty window let in the freezing Chicago wind. She looked at the water stains on the ceiling. The reality of desperate, terrifying poverty, the exact kind of poverty they had mocked me for experiencing when they threw me out at 18, was finally crushing her arrogant spirit. "We cannot survive like this, William." Catherine sobbed, her voice cracking as she clutched her empty designer handbag against her chest. "We are respected people. We belong in high society. We cannot sleep in a place like this. We need to hire lawyers for Savannah. We need to get our lives back. There has to be someone we can call, someone who can post bail and get us a decent hotel." William stared at the rain lashing against the thin glass. He mentally cycled through every business partner, every investor, every wealthy acquaintance they had ever made. They had all abandoned ship. But as the thunder rolled across the dark city skyline, a desperate, sickening realization washed over my father. There was exactly one person left in the entire city of Chicago who possessed the massive financial resources required to save them. One person who owned a highly profitable multi-million-dollar crisis management firm. One person who lived in a secure luxury penthouse just a few miles away. William slowly turned to look at Catherine. His eyes were wide with a frantic, pathetic spark of hope. He realized that after decades of abuse, manipulation, and betrayal, their very last resort was the daughter they had spent their entire lives trying to destroy. The storm outside was relentless. The torrential rain hammered the streets of downtown Chicago, washing away whatever remaining pride my parents possessed. They had spent their last few dollars on a cramped cab ride from the industrial train yards to the affluent neighborhood where my luxury high-rise building stood. They did not belong here anymore. Their expensive clothes were completely ruined, soaked through with cold, dirty rainwater. My building employed a highly trained security detail, but true desperation makes people incredibly resourceful. William and Catherine waited in the freezing downpour near the service loading dock. When a delivery truck temporarily blocked the view of the main concourse guards, they slipped through the side gate and hurried toward the private secured lobby dedicated exclusively to the penthouse residents. They could not get inside the reinforced glass doors without a biometric key, so they stood outside, shivering in the freezing storm, waiting to ambush me. Upstairs, Ethan and I had just finished reviewing the finalized contracts with Malcolm's family trust. We were heading out for a celebratory late dinner. We stepped into our private elevator, the polished doors sliding shut and transporting us smoothly down to the ground floor. I wore a tailored cashmere coat, completely insulated from the bitter weather outside. Ethan held my hand, our shared silence speaking volumes about the absolute peace we had finally secured. The elevator chimed a soft, elegant note as we reached the ground floor lobby. The doors opened to a sprawling expanse of imported marble and warm ambient lighting. But the serene atmosphere was instantly shattered. Through the thick floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the private lobby, I saw them. My mother and father were pressed against the heavy glass doors. Their faces were pale and gaunt, completely devoid of the arrogant superiority they had weaponized against me for my entire life. Water dripped from Catherine's matted hair, ruining the remnants of her expensive salon styling. William's tailored wool suit hung off his frame like wet, heavy rags. They looked absolutely pathetic. The moment they saw me step out of the elevator, their eyes widened in frantic, wild desperation. They began slapping their wet palms against the reinforced glass. "Caroline," my mother screamed. Her voice was muffled by the thick acoustic glass, but the sheer panic in her tone carried through. "Caroline, please, you have to listen to us." Two building security guards immediately rushed forward from the main concourse, their hands reaching for their radios to call for police backup. They recognized a clear threat to a high-profile resident and moved to physically remove my parents from the property. I raised my hand, signaling the guards to stand down. Ethan looked at me, a protective tension radiating through his posture, but he stayed firmly by my side. I walked slowly across the warm, polished marble floor until I stood just inches away from the glass doors. I looked at the two people who had thrown me out into a storm exactly like this one 15 years ago. I reached out and pressed the intercom button on the wall, allowing their voices to filter clearly into the lobby. "Caroline." "Thank God," my father gasped, his teeth actually chattering from the freezing rain. He pressed his face close to the glass. "You have to call off the security. You have to let us inside. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. Malcolm took everything. The bank locked us out of the estate. We have not eaten a real meal in 2 days." I stood perfectly still, my expression completely unreadable. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply watched the consequences of their own actions crush the last remaining breath from their lungs. My mother suddenly dropped to her knees right there on the wet concrete sidewalk. She completely abandoned any lingering shred of the high society dignity she had valued above my life. The dirty rainwater pooled around her legs, soaking into her ruined clothes. She clasped her hands together in a desperate begging gesture. "Please, Caroline." Catherine sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic wail over the intercom. "We are your family. We are your blood. You have millions. You cannot let your parents live on the streets. Savannah is locked in a federal cell and she cannot help us. We know we made mistakes, but you have to save us. You are the only one left." William fell to his knees right beside her, abandoning his pride entirely. He looked up at me through the rain-streaked glass, shivering uncontrollably. "We will do whatever you want." "Caroline," my father pleaded, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "We will make a public apology. We will admit we were wrong about the trust fund and the business. Just give us a place to stay. Just give us enough money to hire a lawyer and get a decent hotel. You are our daughter. You cannot be this cruel to your own flesh and blood." They were using the exact same manipulation tactics they had used at the charity gala. They were trying to weaponize my basic human decency against me. They expected the concept of blood and family to magically erase decades of systemic abuse, gaslighting, and their recent calculated attempt to send me to federal prison. They genuinely believed that because I had built a massive fortune, I owed them salvation from a disaster they had entirely architected themselves. Ethan stepped up close behind me, his silent, unwavering support anchoring me in the moment. He knew I did not need him to fight this battle, but he wanted them to see that I was entirely protected. I looked down at William and Catherine kneeling in the filthy puddles outside my luxury building. I thought about the terrified 18-year-old girl who had begged them not to lock the door 15 years ago. I thought about how they had laughed at me, how they had demanded I sacrifice my freedom for Savannah, and how they had tried to steal my business to protect a billionaire fraud. I did not yell at them. I did not hurl insults through the intercom or tell them how much I hated them. Anger requires emotional investment, and I had completely emptied my emotional accounts regarding these two people long ago. Instead, I maintained absolute chilling eye contact with my mother through the thick glass. Slowly and deliberately, I reached down and unzipped my designer purse. I pushed against the heavy brass handles of the reinforced glass doors. The sudden blast of freezing wind and icy rain hit my face, but I did not shrink away. Ethan immediately stepped forward with me, opening a large black umbrella to shield my shoulders from the storm. We stood together under the protective canopy while the torrential downpour continued to batter my parents exactly where they knelt on the concrete. The contrast between my warm, tailored cashmere coat and their ruined, soaking wet designer clothes painted a perfect picture of our new reality. Catherine scrambled forward on her hands and knees. The dirty water from the loading dock splashed against her ruined skirt. She reached out with trembling, desperate fingers, trying to grab the hem of my coat. Ethan smoothly shifted his stance, placing his expensive leather shoe directly between my mother and my personal space. His silent warning was absolute: do not dare touch my wife. My mother recoiled, her chest heaving with frantic, desperate sobs. She looked up at my designer purse, her eyes tracking the movement of my hand as I reached inside. A sickening spark of hope flared in her bloodshot eyes. My father William mirrored her expression. He wiped the freezing rain from his face, his jaw trembling violently, as he actually tried to force a pathetic, grateful smile onto his face. They genuinely believed I was reaching for a checkbook. They thought I was pulling out a stack of $100 bills, a set of keys to a luxury hotel suite, or a black corporate card to bail Savannah out of her federal holding cell. They thought their emotional manipulation had worked. They believed the simple fact that we shared DNA would override 15 years of systematic abuse and their recent calculated attempt to frame me for a federal crime. I pulled my hand out of my purse. I was not holding a checkbook. I was holding a small, vacuum-sealed plastic sleeve. Inside the clear sleeve was a single crumpled $200 bill. It was old, faded, and heavily creased down the middle. My parents stared at the plastic sleeve in absolute confusion. The heavy rain pounded against the pavement around us, drowning out the ambient noise of the city traffic. I looked down at the small piece of currency in my hand. For 15 years, I had kept this exact bill locked in a biometric safe. I had preserved it through my darkest nights, sleeping in bus terminals, through my years of working 3 minimum wage jobs, and through the grueling process of building my crisis management empire from absolute scratch. Whenever I felt exhausted or close to giving up, I would look at this crumpled piece of paper. It was the ultimate reminder of exactly what my family thought my life was worth. I unsealed the plastic sleeve and pulled the green bill out into the freezing air. The wind immediately whipped at the edges of the paper. "What is that?" Catherine choked out, her voice barely audible over the roaring storm. "We need thousands of dollars, Caroline. We need a high-powered lawyer for Savannah. We need a place to sleep. You cannot just stand there and mock us. We are your flesh and blood. Think about your pregnant sister. Think about the innocent baby she is carrying. The baby she is carrying is a biological fraud, purchased with stolen funds from a billionaire family trust." I replied, my voice projecting clearly and coldly over the sound of the rain. "Savannah is facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and wire fraud. The federal government will provide her with a cot and 3 meals a day. She is no longer your golden child. She is just a federal inmate." William suddenly stood up, his previous desperation morphing into a final pathetic flash of narcissistic rage. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You ungrateful monster," my father screamed, the rain plastering his thinning hair to his forehead. "We will go to the press. We will tell every journalist in this city that you abandoned your destitute parents. We will ruin your pristine public image." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Go ahead, William," I challenged him, staring directly into his frantic eyes. "Call the press." "Oh wait, you do not have phones that work anymore because the FBI froze your accounts. The elite journalists you used to drink champagne with have blocked your numbers. Your country club banned you. You have absolutely no voice left in this city. You are ghosts." William opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a defense, a lie, or another pathetic manipulation. No words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own karma crashing down upon him. He slowly sank back down to his knees in the dirty water next to my weeping mother. "Do you recognize this money?" I asked, holding the bill out toward them. "You shoved this into my hand, locked the front door of your massive estate, and told me to go freeze in the streets because I refused to take the fall for Savannah's hit and run. You told me I was garbage. You told me I would never survive without your wealth. I positioned the crumpled $200 bill directly over the deep, muddy puddle that was rapidly pooling around their shivering knees. I slowly opened my fingers. The faded green bill fluttered in the harsh wind before dropping straight down into the filthy, freezing water at their feet. The dirty rainwater immediately soaked into the paper, ruining it completely. "Here is your startup capital back," I said, my tone absolute and final, with interest. "The train station is 2 miles that way. Start walking." I turned my back on their horrified, wailing screams. I gave a sharp nod to my building security guards, signaling them to physically remove the trespassers from the perimeter. Ethan and I stepped back inside the warm, brightly lit marble lobby. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind us, with a solid, satisfying click, locking them out of my life forever. It has been 8 months since that freezing rainstorm washed the last toxic remnants of my family out of my life completely. The federal judicial system moved with a brutal, unforgiving efficiency, especially when billionaire assets and high-profile wire fraud were involved. Savannah did not receive the delicate, sympathetic treatment she so arrogantly expected. She was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for grand larceny, interstate wire fraud, and money laundering. I heard through Ethan's legal network that her adjustment to federal prison life was spectacular in all the absolute worst ways. The woman who once sobbed uncontrollably over a scuffed designer handbag now wears a standard issue coarse khaki jumpsuit every single day. Her luxurious days of lounging in VIP casino suites in Monaco and chartering private jets to Milan were permanently replaced by mandatory cafeteria duty and a rigid, inescapable daily schedule dictated by prison guards. She tried to play the fragile, weeping victim during her sentencing hearing, attempting to manipulate the judge with her manufactured tears. But the judge had already listened to the leaked audio recordings of her laughing maliciously about forging genetic material and stealing $15 million. There was absolutely no mercy for a calculated fraud. Her billionaire husband erased her from his life with a single signature, and the child she tried to use as a shield was placed in the custody of the anonymous donor registry. Savannah was left with nothing but the cold concrete walls of her cell. William and Catherine faced a very different yet equally devastating kind of prison. The federal government seized absolutely everything they owned to pay back the stolen charity funds and settle their massive legal debts. Without their sprawling suburban mansion, their leased luxury vehicles, and their stolen high society prestige, they were reduced to absolute zero. They currently live in a tiny 300-square-foot studio apartment on the desolate far outskirts of the city. The walls of their unit are paper thin, the heating barely works, and the plumbing constantly leaks. To simply survive and pay their weekly rent, they were forced to enter the manual labor workforce. My father, the man who used to strut around in custom-tailored suits, demanding 50% of my multi-million-dollar agency, now works the grueling overnight shift stocking heavy boxes at a discount grocery store. My mother, who used to sneer at anyone she deemed beneath her elite country club standards, now sweeps floors and scrubs toilets at a local public laundromat. According to a private investigator, Ethan occasionally speaks with their cramped, miserable apartment is a constant war zone. They spend their few waking hours screaming at each other, bitterly trading the blame for their spectacular downfall. William blames Catherine for encouraging Savannah's greed, while Catherine blames William for executing the forged documents so poorly. They have completely lost their golden child, their wealth, and their social standing. They have nothing left in this world but their mutual misery and the crushing weight of their own karma. While they tore each other apart in the dismal ruins of their own arrogance, my public relations agency soared to unprecedented heights. The corporate world respects absolute surgical precision above all else. When the elite business circles realized how flawlessly I had dismantled a $15 million embezzlement scheme while fully protecting a billionaire dynasty from public ruin, my office phone did not stop ringing. Malcolm and his father flew back up to Chicago last month. We sat in my executive suite, not as hostile adversaries, but as permanent business partners. Malcolm's family holding company officially retained my firm as their exclusive crisis management team. They signed a 10-year contract with a retainer worth tens of millions of dollars. Malcolm shook my hand warmly before he left, expressing a quiet, profound gratitude for excising the parasite that had attached itself to his family legacy. My business was no longer just successful. It was completely untouchable, built on a foundation of unyielding integrity and unmatched strategy. This morning, the sky over Chicago was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The brutal, freezing storms of the past were entirely gone, replaced by the bright, warming light of a new season. I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony of my penthouse, wrapping a soft cashmere shawl around my shoulders against the crisp morning air. Ethan followed a moment later, handing me a steaming mug of black coffee. He wrapped his arm securely around my waist, pulling me close as we looked out over the magnificent skyline. The city stretched out far below us, vibrant and alive, filled with endless possibilities and quiet victories. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. For 15 years, I had deeply believed that simply surviving my family was my greatest achievement. I thought that outlasting their cruelty, ignoring their insults, and building a secure life from a single crumpled $200 bill was the ultimate victory. But standing here at the absolute peak of the city, surrounded by the empire I had built from the ground up and the husband who fiercely loved and protected me, I realized the absolute truth. True power was not just surviving their relentless abuse. True power was having the strength to walk away, stepping back into the shadows and letting them architect their own magnificent destruction. They built the trap, they loaded the weapon, and they pulled the trigger. I simply refused to be the target anymore. And as I watched the morning sun reflect off the glass towers of Chicago, I knew I would never have to look back again. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true power does not come from fighting your toxic family members directly. It comes from stepping back and letting their own arrogance destroy them. For 15 years, I believed that simply surviving their cruelty was my biggest victory. I was wrong. When you stop playing the victim and refuse to participate in their manipulative games, their entire house of cards collapses under its own weight. You do not have to save people who willingly jump off a cliff. Share your own experiences with toxic relatives in the comments below.